All right, everyone, welcome. This is a conversation with Jose Antonio Vargas. I am Christina Bellantoni. I am a professor of professional practice here at Annenberg, fairly new to the school, so this is my first official forum event, and special thanks to all of the Annenberg folks who helped make this possible. I know it's a lot of work setting these up, and I'm really appreciative of everybody who's made it happen. So thank you. And without further ado, we are going to get started. So Jose Antonio Vargas is many things. He is the founder of the nonprofit Define American, which he is advertising on his shirt, I will point out. He's a Pulitzer-prize winning journalist, filmmaker, director of an MTV series, the author of Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen, and feeling a little naked today because he lost his cell phone, so go easy on him. We will be taking some questions from you all toward the end. But I wanted to start with the book, which you can see a lot of...
All my stuff is like in your...
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a very, very big wall there. So this is a book, Jose, about your personal journey. And writing it, I know, was both cathartic and the hardest thing you'd really ever done.
Yes.
So what did you aim to accomplish? And did you?
First of all, I'm really happy to be here. Christina and I met each other 2007 campaign. We were both on the campaign trail. We met in Charleston, South Carolina. So we go a long way back. So it's really great to be here. I didn't realize this is your first forum at this.
Yeah, I've done a couple other things,
That's
but nothing
awesome.
just, us.
Great. And you all, please, if you're gonna join us, please sit in the front. So we have more people here. So I wanted to do a book that was not about immigration reform. Actually, a journalist from the San Francisco Weekly, a couple of weeks ago, she was interviewing me for the book, and she said, I looked for the phrase immigration reform in the book and I didn't find it. And I said, well, that was, that's the goal. I didn't want to write about immigration reform because everybody already talks about immigration reform. So I wanted to talk about really mental health, because I think from a journalistic standpoint, I don't think we talk about immigration or immigrants from that perspective. Like we're always seen from left, right, politics, policy, Democrat, Republican, Trump. Like those are like well, what does this actually mean every day? What does it mean? Me personally, as a journalist who basically plopped myself in the middle of the story. So that was my goal, is to get at a better understanding of the emotional toll of the issue, and I absolutely accomplished that personally. Christina knows this because she read an early version of the entire book. And it was not only cathartic, but I think it was also just necessary. I felt like as a 37-year-old, I make more sense to myself now than I ever did. So that was like the gift that the book, I think, gave me. Yeah.
And, that's a good point about being 37 and thinking about all of these things that you've accomplished in your career. Here we are at the heart of a journalism and communications school, and I think one thing that, since you came out as an undocumented person, that has been your story, right? We know
Yes.
about when you went with, to try to get a driver's license and you were turned away because of your papers. You've shared so much about that, but I think one thing I want to go back to, which we don't talk about as much anymore, is how you got your start in journalism.
Oh, yeah.
Setting that part aside, you worked real hard and you got jobs very early and you got a good education. So talk to us about.
Yeah, because we are at Annenberg. So I could not have gotten into this school because you needed higher GPAs. And I graduated high school in 2000, so a year before the DREAM Act was introduced. So there was no language around undocumented anything. So I remember actually going to a college fair and seeing the USC Annenberg thing, and I picked it up, I looked at it, and social security number. So it had requirements that I just couldn't. So it's really great to be here. It's a long time to say that. But my career really started accidentally, right? So as Christina was saying, I found that I was undocumented when I went to the DMV to get a driver's license. That was in April 1997. Some of you probably were not born yet. And after I found that out, this was again in '97, so there was no way to Google that. It's not like I can just like Google or hashtag how do I get a license. So thankfully, it was about maybe 4 or 5 months that it was just I didn't know what to do with myself. I thought it was I thought I was led to believe by the way the news media covered the issue that this was about Mexican people. And I'm Filipino, so I was like, wait, I'm not Mexican, what is this about? So it's not like I can like find other undocumented people to talk to. But thankfully, my English teacher, Mrs. Dewar, said I asked too many annoying questions and I should do this thing called journalism. That was the first I had heard of it. I come from a lower middle class Filipino family. Like my grandfather was a security guard, my grandmother was a food server. We didn't read. I think the only thing in the book that was like reading material was the encyclopedia from the garage sale that we bought as a decorative thing. We didn't open it. We watched TV, But when Mrs. Dewar said, you asked me annoying questions, you should do journalism, I went to a journalism camp at San Francisco State University, and I found out that when you write a news story, you get a byline. So that would mean that my name would be on the piece of paper. So I thought if my name could be in the piece of paper, then how can they say that I'm not here? That was literally the only reason why I became a journalist. If my name could be on a piece of paper, then they couldn't say that I wasn't here. And then, this was 98 at that point. And so then I got mentors, including a woman named Ernest Smith, who used to teach actually at Annenberg. She was at the journalism school at San Francisco State. And I was mentored very early on. I'm saying this because I find mentorship absolutely crucial. Like to me, it's like one of the foundational things that you gotta do as a journalist. You got to find mentors who can actually call bullshit on you. Oh, sorry, is that okay? Who can like-
Just one.
Just one. Who can like call BS on you, who can tell you that you're not that good. Like you're actually not that good. Or you need to learn more, right? So that really started my career. And Erna was among the people who like kind of opened the idea that I could intern for the Washington Post. And I remember when I turned in my application for the Washington Post, thinking that I would never get it. Because like 500 people apply, only 20 slots. So then I got it. And then when they called, Cheryl Butler, the woman at the Washington Post said, well, yeah, you need to come here and you need to show up with a driver's license. And ever since I found out that I was here illegally because of the driver's license thing, I hadn't gotten a license, right? So this was 2003. And thankfully, actually, I put this in the book against the advice of the lawyers, but I actually put in the book the process of how an undocumented person in 2003 got a license. And that was research, like reporting, right? I spent like a whole day at the public library and printed out the requirements for every state. So every state has its own requirements of getting driver's licenses. Back in 2003, for undocumented people, there were only 2 states, Tennessee and Oregon. And Oregon was close enough to California, so I drove up there with my superintendent's assistant's son, who I didn't know. Basically, there was an entire conspiracy of people who I grew up with in high school that actually got me a license. And that license was valid for 8 years. So from 2003 to 2011, I had this license that was my only piece of ID. And that allowed me to go to the Washington Post. And then when I got to the Post, it's one thing to be undocumented working for the San Francisco Chronicle. It was a whole other thing to be undocumented at the Washington Post. So it was very I was paranoid. And I think back then in 2003, there was I was the only one who was neither black nor white. There were a couple of other Asian people. So the newsroom was not very diverse, right? It was actually pretty good in terms of black people. There were a lot of black editors and writers, but in terms of Latino and Asian, they were like, what is that? There just wasn't that many. So I was just paranoid. And so a few months after I actually got hired, I told somebody. I told the head of one of the heads of the HR department, and I expected him to report me. I told him everything, the fake papers, the Social Security, all of that. And I expected him to report me. And instead, he was actually like, don't tell anybody else. Just keep going. His name is Peter Pearl. He was hired at the Washington Post by Bob Woodward in 1981, the same year I was born. And now actually Peter just joined the board of directors of Define American to help us really help newsrooms better cover what this issue is.
And so then what did you cover? What were your beats? And what were some of the mistakes you might have made as a journalist
that's a great
starting out?
Nothing immigration. I think I was probably the only Jose who was a reporter in Washington, D.C., and I did not do anything immigration. There was one time I was assigned to interview Mel Martinez, who was then the senator from Florida, who was the incoming chair of the Republican National Committee, and they wanted me to talk to him about Republicans and immigration. And I couldn't say no to the editor because they're like, hey, Jose, you gotta go cover this thing. And Gerhardt was the editor. So I went, and the whole time I was like, I don't know. So that was the only time I ever had to actually write and interview someone else about immigration while not disclosing to my bosses or my editors that I was undocumented. So I basically, when I was in DC, I focused on two things. One, the culture of technology. That was my big beat. Actually, the first time I was at USC was in 2005. The Grand Theft Auto 3 just came out.
Oh, man.
Was it 3 or something? San Andreas. And apparently, according to the people who made the video game, they based it in South Central LA. And I didn't know what South Central LA was. So I went here, I convinced my editor to let me go to South Central and find Mexican-American kids who play Grand Theft Auto and compare their experience of playing a game that was based on their lives. That was 2005. So I was really lucky that I was able to write stories that no one else was writing. So technology culture, and then AIDS. I stumbled across the fact that Washington, D.C. has had the worst AIDS crisis in the country. About 4% of the whole city is already HIV positive. That's the largest of any city in America. And that's because D.C. has, from a demographic perspective, a high intravenous drug use, so a lot of drug users. Really just abject poverty in many parts of the city. So by the time people by the time people realize that they're sick, they already have AIDS. They don't have HIV anymore because it's gone advanced. So between those two beats, I was kind of really busy. So I was writing about culture of technology and then AIDS. That was it for 4 years. And then around 2007, you guys might not remember this, Hillary Clinton announced she was running for president on a YouTube video. She was sitting in a couch. I was eating a Ben & Jerry's ice cream, watching her announcement. And I was like, wait a second, a lot of my political reporter colleagues don't have YouTube. They don't know what YouTube is. So I wrote a memo explaining what YouTube and Facebook, there was no Twitter yet.
That very first day.
That very first day that she announced she was running for president, I wrote a memo. I called it my mission statement because of Jerry Maguire. I love that movie. So I wrote a memo literally outlining what is YouTube. So politics is top down. Politics is all about control. Well, what is YouTube gonna do to politics, given that it's not about control, right? And I did something really bad. Have I told you this, Christina?
Maybe.
Because if I had sent that memo to my boss, or to my boss's boss, or to my boss's boss's boss, it would have never made it to the top people. So I sent it directly to the top people. Bill Bennett, the managing editor, and Len Downey, the the executive editor, which got me in a lot of trouble because you're not supposed to do that. My editor, her editor, were all pissed. But my reasoning was, they're not gonna let a 26-year-old kid be a political reporter. And actually, I didn't explain something else. So before this happened, David Hoffman, the foreign editor, in 2005, asked me if I wanted to go to Iraq to cover the war. He wanted me to write my Jose stories in Baghdad. I didn't know what to tell him. I went to the bathroom, sat in the toilet, and was like, what do I tell this guy? And so I went back, we were having lunch. I went back to the table and I said, you know, I grew up overseas. I don't need to go to Baghdad. He was such a nice guy. David Hoffman was like, Jose, there's only two ways to matter at the Washington Post: foreign correspondent or political reporter. Oh, I'll be a political reporter. And he was like, how are you gonna do that? So I got to do that because of Hillary Clinton announcing she was running for president on YouTube.
And the lesson in that, I mean, just give this some thought, is speaking up. You know, I've told some of you this in our interactions here at Annenberg already, right? Saying something that you're passionate about, something you're interested in. You know, maybe don't go to your boss's 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 boss.
Don't do that.
I don't know.
I
You
don't.
got detention.
But you know, but I did apologize to all of the women. Because that was the other thing. All of my bosses, it was 3 layers of bosses. They were all women, and I basically leapfrogged all of them to go to the guys. And I'll never forget this, because I was seen as the technology guy at the Washington Post. This is when Don Graham still used to own the Washington Post, not Jeff Bezos. And I was at the very meeting when the Jim Vandehei and John Harris was pitching the Washington Post this thing called Politico. You got Politico. So basically like a sped up version of politics. And I was at this meeting because they wanted my technology perspective. And I was like, but the Washington Post let it go. They let that go because they didn't think it was their thing. And I was sitting at that meeting thinking, man, like this sounds like an actually exciting thing to cover politics from that perspective. So I'm really happy, by the way, that Christina's asking me these questions, because for the most part, it seems as if my journalism career just got erased. All of a sudden, I'm just an undocumented person. I'm like an immigration person, when I actually had a pretty, journalism is church to me. Reporting is religion. Like, this is how I know myself, is because of journalism. And so it matters a lot to me. What we do matters a lot to me. And I tried to do my work in the past 7 years with as much kind of journalistic kind of aesthetic as possible.
Yeah. And we're going to come back to that quite a bit. That actually reminds me of, I believe, your lead when we covered Oprah Winfrey in South Carolina with Barack Obama was something about Oprah going to church.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but that's exactly it. And so that's part of this. When I was working in Washington, I had been reading Jose's name in the paper for a while and really liked his stories. And he wrote something, and now I don't even remember what it was, about being from Mountain View, which I'm from San Jose. I covered Mountain View in one of my first jobs at a daily paper, the city council and the school board. And I was like, oh man, this guy's from my hometown. Like, I already liked him, but then I was like, felt this connection with him. And then I read on, and he put the year that he had graduated in there. And whoa, he's young, he's younger than me, and here he is at the Washington Post, like someone that I aspired to be, who was actually doing amazing work and wasn't 55 at the Washington Post. And so then we were at this debate in Charleston, South Carolina. It was the YouTube debate, and
The
you
first
guys
ever
probably don't remember this, but they had a snowman ask a question, like an animated snowman, about climate change. But Jose was at the next table, and I took a leap, and I said, hey, I wanted to know you, here's who I am. And not only did we become fast friends, but I think we've been having these conversations about journalism and how it has evolved, and the ways that we tell stories, and the ways that we really connect with people as human beings for a very long time. And I think that's one of the things I want to talk to you about now, because this is an entirely different world since then. You know, it's only 11 years. And obviously your world has completely changed, but the world we're in, as you mentioned, Twitter wasn't around. The way that we've covered things has completely changed. So what is the state of journalism today? How do you assess it?
Well, to me, there's the state of journalism as it is when you see it with Jim Acosta, with President Trump, right? So there's that. But really what I'm more concerned about is what is state of journalism that's happening inside there, and like what this looks like. The fact that the industry actually has to change. It has to actually evolve. And the fact that local news is, to me, still the most important source of information for people. And yet everything is so nationalized that we don't think really much about local news. I was just in Hattiesburg, Mississippi for a book event a couple of weeks ago, and I started realizing that the reporters who came to my event to cover my book didn't know anything about immigration. So we actually went to their newsroom and gathered some editors and said, oh, like, this is how you could cover this issue outside of just quote unquote immigration reform. So, okay, I'm gonna give you a little bit of a spiel. So, in this country, I'm sure you've heard about the 800,000 DACA recipients, right? There's 800,000 DACA recipients who are part of who are part of the 11 million undocumented people. So there's 11 million of us who are here illegally. Although, if I'm to count every white undocumented person that I met at Starbucks, I think it's way more than 11 million people. I've kept a list. I've had maybe 60 undocumented white people approach me at random Starbucks across the country who say that, hey, I'm undocumented, I'm a chemist, an accountant, but I'm not out about my status.
They're European, Australian.
Yeah, usually French, sorry, I'm a little sick. French, Canadian, or British. Those are the top three. But they usually come up to me because they feel really guilty about the fact that whenever this issue gets talked about, it's not about them. And then they offer to buy me my iced coffee, and I'm like, no, I got my iced coffee. But you can go to defineamerican.com and you can put your story, right? So a lot of what we do is we are now the largest collectors of stories of undocumented people and their family members. So, for example, in Mississippi, as I said, I wanted to give these reporters sources. So here are other undocumented people in the state of Mississippi that you can be talking to so that you understand what this is like from an undocumented Jamaican's perspective, an undocumented Indian woman's perspective. So a lot of what I do is still kind of in that realm because my story is just one story, right? And we can't focus on one story. As far as I'm concerned, our job is to really complicate it, to make people understand how layered it is. So right now in this country, there's 11 million undocumented people who are part of the 43 million immigrant population. There are 43 million immigrants in America today, 43 million. According to Pew, they will constitute 88% of the total US population growth in the next 50 years. Meaning Latinos and Asians are having way more babies than white people are and black people are. I don't know what's going on. But so what does that mean for us as news producers? What about mixed race people, right? Like California is like the capital of biracial people. Like the census is about to come up. Oh my God, I'm so scared of the census. Like here we are, we're gonna count our country, and yet I don't think we really have the journalistic language to do that.
And how do you fit in one box?
How do you fit into one box? And now that there's a citizenship question, 800,000 undocumented people in the LA area alone? How many of them are gonna wanna check a box when they know that the moment they check a box that says a citizen, they may get targeted? So what happens when we can't count people? So to me, that's a big journalistic question, right? So our job has always been to kind of complicate that. And I think I did that in my book in terms of really complicating my own narrative. But yeah, for me, that's what has kept me doing what I'm doing for the past 7 years is I still think of it as journalism. I still think of it as storytelling. Right now, actually, the biggest part of our work, so the moment DACA, they got rid of DACA, when Trump said we're ending DACA, one of the first people to contact Define American was Shonda Rhimes because she's amazing. So Shonda emailed and said, how can I help? And then there's about 100 undocumented medical students today that we know of in the country, right? Who are in medical schools, who have DACA. So we sent like 5 undocumented medical students to her writer's room here in LA, and they built an entire episode of Grey's Anatomy around an undocumented medical student. So now here in Hollywood, if you see an immigration storyline on television, it's probably because Define American helped them put that storyline on television. That's a big part of our work.
And that's a good opportunity for me to mention this report that you did
Yeah.
with the Norman Lear Center, which looked at the immigrant portrayals on television, right? That this is not an easy topic because oftentimes, and I say this a lot about Muslim Americans too, you
Yes.
only see them depicted in a certain light, not just in an everyday light.
So I made this film called White People for MTV a few years ago. We did a study with MTV. Define American did a study with MTV. And the whole film was all about what does it mean to be young and white in a country that's getting less and less white, right? But we did a study with MTV that was really, for me, staggering. Apparently, 90% of white people, young white people, have predominantly white friends. And no amount of listening to Drake counts. Like, you can't count that. And then 75% of young white people live in predominantly white towns. So what does that mean? So the only time you would ever be engaging or dealing with someone who's a person of color and an immigrant in front of you is the news media you consume and the television shows and movies you watch. Media plays a central role into how people perceive how people are. So if all the time you see on television, like I did in the 1990s, whenever anybody said anything about quote unquote illegal people, it was always about Mexican, then I'm never gonna think that Asians could be undocumented, when in the reality is, Asian immigrants are actually the fastest growing undocumented population in this country. 1 out of 7 Koreans is here illegally, 1 out of 7, right? And yet, that's not part of the narrative. We don't talk about that. So that's why what we do is so important, because we actually are opening not only people's understandings about facts, but seeing themselves into what they're consuming. I think it's so important.
Well, and we've talked a lot about this, and you've talked about it in many forms, about the idea of being an activist and considering yourself a journalist. And I'll tell, when you first decided to come out in an essay in the New York Times, I knew that. I had known Jose's story ahead of time because we were so close, and we talked at length about when it was going to come out, what the rollout would be like. And I thought a lot about it, and I went and I told my boss, and I said, hey, you know what? Like, I would walk in front of a truck for Jose, and this is going to happen today, and I can't stay silent about it. And I don't feel like that colors what I do here. And at the time, I was editing stories about midterm politics. And my boss was amazing and basically was like, yeah, this is your friend, don't worry about it. And I've since now, many years later, have a totally different perspective on this, in which it's about transparency, right? I love talking about my friendship with you, my passion for you, all the different things we've done together. I mean, we've grieved together, we've gone to the Super Bowl together, we have, gotten drunk together, like many, many layers of this. And I think that people understand that's where I'm coming from. I am an objective journalist as best I can be on everything, but I can talk about my personal feelings. And I feel like that's really where the media is going. We've seen, you used to be Ezra Klein's colleague at Fox, right? Or it's at the Washington Post, now he's at Fox. Everybody knows where he's coming from. No one wouldn't call him a journalist.
I actually find Ezra really interesting in this regard, because so Ezra Klein actually took my desk at the Washington Post. When I left, he took my desk. And then he blew up to being Ezra Klein, which is amazing, right? But I find it interesting that people like Ezra Klein and Chris Hayes can be seen as reputable, objective journalists when they're very, very clear about where they stand. And yet, when a woman of all races or a person of color says something, all of a sudden, who we are is seen as bias. Who we are is seen as an agenda, right? Well, what's the agenda of straight white men? That's a big agenda, right? Not to isolate straight white guys, right? Like, we need you, clearly. So but everybody has some sort of an agenda and where they're coming from. And I think, especially now, we can't hide behind this, oh, I'm objective. My question is, how factual is your reporting? How much context are you actually providing people? Are you illuminating something? Are you providing insight? Those to me is the judge. So I used, as Christina knows, I used to get so pissed off when people are like, the activist, Jose Antonio Vargas. Because I've written 2,000 articles since I was a kid. I had 5 corrections in my entire career. That matters to me. 5, and all of them are spelling names, correct? I'm so pissed about that. But, so my career really matters to me. So all of a sudden to just be like, oh, now I'm an activist? Because I'm undocumented. Now, mind you, as Christina knows, no one was outing me. I voluntarily did this against the advice of lawyers, right? I thought my dream job when I was growing up was to edit The New Yorker. That's what I was gonna do that, I thought. So for me, I've come to this conclusion in the same way you have, Christina, that I don't really have control over people calling me activist or advocate, whatever you wanna call me. The only thing I have control over is the work, right? And the work has to be so good that you can't deny what it is and what it stands for.
And that's, if you guys haven't read the book, again, it's amazing. But you start with this story about being detained. And, it is an important reminder, everything Jose does is that terrific personal risk, right? Everyone knows who you are. We're
Especially
in Lemonade, we're getting approached by people, who want to say thank you, but not everybody always wants to say thank you. And this is a very intense time in this country. And so, you are still at risk.
But I'm kind of prepared for that. But also the thing is, what we do as journalists is risky. This is a risky thing, asking questions. It's a risky thing to try to find answers to questions that may not have easy answers. I would actually argue that the questions are more important than the answers, right? And what I'm asking people, how you define American, that's a very provocative question. When I ask that in Mississippi or Toledo, Ohio, it's not like this. People are like, what? When I say that legality is actually a construct of power, people start walking out. Or people call ICE on me, and I'm like, it's not like I'm hiding from them. I'm right here. I have the yellow shoes on. I mean, give me a break. I'm not hiding from nobody. But I'm prepared for that risk. My friends, Christina knows that when I get detained, she'll get a phone call. So I've done everything I can to be as prepared as possible for all of this. The one thing though that I was not prepared for was people's projection and expectations of what I'm supposed to be, right? Because I used to write about people. I don't get written about. And my nephew, who's about to go to college, I guess he's writing his he's writing his college paper on me, which is like, oh gosh.
Wow.
And so, but he was Googling me, and he was like, Uncle, there's all these stories. And I'm like, and I don't read them. I don't read the stories, whatever. But I have no control over that. I have no control of however people want to say that I'm not radical enough because I'm not tying myself to the White House fence, right? Or people who say that I'm too, I'm not down with Democrats enough. Like I should do more with progressive people. I'm sorry, I think, first of all, as a journalist, it's not my responsibility to be of either of these parties.
And you're not like an advocate for campaigns either.
I don't do that. Well, I just don't do that. I don't, if I'm gonna endorse somebody, just we're friends. It's not because I have never participated in it that way, but for me, it's all about, this is something I think that journalism taught me as a kid, is we are responsible for our own independence. Like, the most important thing you have to have is intellectual independence and freedom. You have to have done your homework in such a way, you have to have really reported the hell out of something to feel completely independent that no one can tag you as one way. One of the biggest stories I ever wrote was a profile of Mark Zuckerberg. It's one of those long New Yorker stories. It was like 10,000 words long, right? This was 2010, before I came out as Undocumented. And I knew that I had done my job when no one was happy. Mark wasn't happy. Like, none of the people I talked to were happy. But that was because I had done my job, right? Like, your job is not to make anybody happy. Your job is to do as much reporting as you can and write as an independent, free thing as you possibly can. May it be a podcast or a TV show or an article.
When I believe it must have been 2008 or 2009, Jose and I did this panel. I think it was at a high school or something. It was on C-SPAN.
Oh my God,
yes. And we took questions from the audience, and a high school student stood up and said, talk about what it's like to be a minority in a newsroom. And I turned to Jose, and Jose is like, oh, I'll let Christina go first. And I was kind of like, oh, I'm a woman, I'm a minority. Like, that was the first time.
Oh my God, I didn't even know that.
I had ever thought of myself as that. Now, this was early in my career, and there could be whole other panels about what's happened since and the way people treat women in leadership. However, it was a really provocative moment for me, and it really changed the way I thought
She's
about
never told me that.
Everything.
Oh, okay.
And I think diversity in newsrooms is something that I'm very, very passionate about. It's something that Annenberg is really dedicated to, not just in newsrooms, but everywhere, diversity and inclusion. But the news media is not. We know that. And it's not just, I've told this story a few times here, but the 2016 election at the LA Times, I didn't vote for Donald Trump, but neither did anyone in the entire newsroom. And I kept thinking, that's a really interesting thing that we don't have anyone in this newsroom that is of that perspective. It's a newsroom that spoke more than a dozen languages, but you didn't have someone that sort of represented that thought. Not writing from an agenda, but just thinking in those terms. And so it's all sorts of diversity that are important. I wonder your thoughts on what can we be doing as an institution training the next generation of journalists to make sure that diverse voices are not only included in our work, but also represented in leadership?
I mean, I never thought of diversity as a slice of the pie. I think of it as the entire pan. You know, like, again, I don't want to get all numbers on you. Again, 88% of the total US population growth in a country that can barely talk about black people without having a panic attack, right? And where do Native Americans fit in this conversation? So Define American actually, last year, I was really happy about this. We had a 2-day convening at the Kennedy Center in DC of Native American tribal leaders and immigrant rights leaders for 2 days, and the subject was land and citizenship, right? So diversity in everything we do is, to me, it's not only important, but I can't kind of exist without it. Like, even at Define American in our team, we have this young woman who just joined us about 2 years ago now, actually, black woman from DC. And she goes in all the immigration phone calls. And she texted me one time and she goes, Jose, I don't know what anybody is saying on these calls because it's all acronyms. And then finally she said something that's like, oh, what is your appeal to like African Americans in the South? Complete, utter silence. Why? Because immigrant rights people don't really talk to black people or white people. I'm making an overgeneralization here, but for the most part, immigrant rights people talk among Latinos and sometimes among Asians, if that, right? But again, my journalism, I think, experience always insists on who is not in the room. Like, I'm glad, I'm happy you remember that, Christina. I actually remember that part, but I didn't know that that's what you thought about that. But I think a lot about how we cover certain issues with this country would be different if more women were in charge of the newsrooms and the actual, like, budgets, the actually how news is covered, and not just relegated to the lifestyle sections, right? I think it'd be totally different. And yet, it's seen as a women's perspective, where what I worry about right now more than anything else, I think, as I'm saying this as a human being more than anything else, is I almost feel as if in America today, and this is coming from somebody we had to do this for a grant. I've done 1,200 events in 49 states and 400 colleges in 7 years. I've been everywhere. I've been to every Tea Party meeting that I've gotten invited to. So I've talked to a lot of people. That's why I think I remember telling Christina, after I made white people, I was like, Donald Trump is gonna win president. And Christina was like, Jose, no way. And I kept saying, Christina, I gotta tell you, I'm an expert now on this. White people, I'm telling you, they're gonna vote for him. A certain kind of white people. It's so easy to tell people what you're against. It's so hard to tell people what we're for. Like, what are we building together? And let's take that now in a journalistic setting. Like, how should a news organization cover its community? Arthur Miller, the playwright, probably has the best quote about newspapers. He said, a good newspaper is a country talking to itself. A good newspaper is a country talking to itself. So who's doing all the talking? Are we really talking to everybody? Those are the questions that I know for me that drive kind of what I do when we tell stories.
Speaking of the president, has he ever tweeted about you?
No, not yet.
It's kind of shocking.
Apparently somebody gave him the book. I just found out. Have I told you that?
No.
Somebody gave him the book 2 weeks ago.
Like as a present?
How was that? I don't know. But look, I'm so prepared for what can happen. This I haven't said before, but Christina knows this because we're friends. She's one of my best friends. When I was writing this book, I actually thought about leaving. So I wrote the book thinking that I was gonna leave. So the book would get out. I'm responsible for HarperCollins to promote it until December. And then I'll see you later. I've been here 25 years. I gotta go see my mom. I was really afraid that I can't be artistically free because I'm always gonna be the immigration guy. And my career matters a lot to me. And so I'm like, let me go do what I do in Canada. Define Canadian, right? There's 258 million migrants in the world. The largest ever movement of people. 258 million people. The great majority of whom, by the way, are moving to countries that previously colonized and imperialized them. So for me, that's my storytelling challenge. How do you tell the stories of all those people? So I thought it'd be better to do that outside of this country. I thought. And Canada was really not that expensive. I thought it'd be more expensive. It wasn't really that expensive. So I thought, hey, why not? I told Christina. And then after I wrote the book, I'm staying. So I've decided that not only am I staying, I'm gonna dig even deeper and be prepared for, so if he decides to deport me, it would take years for him to do that because I would have to be fought in the courts. So I've decided now that I would fight it. But honestly, I don't think they're gonna do anything. I think they're just gonna keep me in limbo, but I can't be in limbo. I have to keep actually going. So as Christina knows, I'm in the process right now of buying a house. That's how far I've gone. I've gone from like looking at Craigslist to apartments in Toronto to now buying a house. How does an undocumented person with no DACA buy a house? What a great journalism story, right? So I'm literally living that right now, like figuring out how to do that. So, but as Christina says, I'm being as transparent as possible.
So I'm going to ask you one last news question, and then we'll turn it over to your questions in the time we have left. But so the caravan, which we heard a lot about before the midterm elections, which were just 6 days ago, 8 days ago.
Was that 6 days ago?
I've lost all track of time. But yeah, and now we're not hearing about it at all, right? And we understand that,
Yeah.
you know, and anyone that sort of follows politics knows that there was a reason the drumbeat was getting beat before the elections. But you know, what's a good way to talk about this story? How should journalists be approaching something that is still many, many miles from the border, weeks away?
So there's the facts and there's the context, right? The facts are, you know, I was on Fox News actually on election night because I do that sometimes. And I was supposed to be on it for 3 minutes, went on for 8 minutes. It was a one-on-one between me and Martha McCullum, I think was her name. And I was trying to tell her that there's a difference between being a refugee, an asylee, and an immigrant. Those are 3 different legal classifications because she just kept calling them illegal immigrants. And I said, first of all, they're not. Second of all, there's actually a reason why they're called refugees, right? And then on air, I said to her, Martha, do you remember what happened in the 80s when Reagan sided with a lot of the rebels in those countries during the Civil War in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala? She was like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, why are they coming? Why is it so dangerous? It's not enough to say that they're seeking a better life. It's not enough to say they want the American dream. I can do that. What's harder is to say, what are the root causes of why people have to move? And she just couldn't handle that question on air. She was like, you're trying to no, I'm just asking you. Like, we have to explain why people are coming. And then we have to say that, right, that actually illegal border crossings from Mexico are at the lowest level since the 1970s. We have to say that these are not, quote unquote, illegal immigrants seeking life here because they're actually not even the fastest growing undocumented population. We have to say that it's actually a legal process for them to apply for asylum. There is a legal process. So after that happened, my organization, Define American, I think we blasted a one-page sheet to as many reporters as we could, TV, radio, and print, to say that these are the difference between refugee, migrant, immigrant, and asylee. So that's the kind of, to me, the kind of specificity and also what we journalists have to do. We have to really explain to people what's the difference between a Chinese businessman who buys a building in downtown LA and poof, becomes a US citizen, because you can do that, versus an undocumented Mexican woman whose farm was taken because of NAFTA, who then had to cross the border, versus a Korean person who overstayed their visa to go to school here. Those are 4 different stories, and yet all of them are just thought of as like the illegal immigration problem. And I have to say, you guys are in Annenberg. Like, you all are like in the epicenter of this, right? There's like a wealth of stories. I haven't even talked about the Me Too movement. The intersection between gender rights, right, and the immigrant rights movement is huge. The fact that there's so many women now in LA, Latinas, for example, who won't call the cops because if they call, they're afraid ICE may show up. That's a big story that all women should care about, not just Latinas. So I just hope that you all could understand just how much wealth you have here. And we need your help to do that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's
Thank you,
great. So I think I might have the
Questions?
only mic.
Yeah.
So if you have a question, I will give you my mic, and then
cool.
you can raise your hand. Questions? Surely there are questions.
Is this not Annenberg? What? Yes.
Make sure it ends in a question mark, please.
Oh,
Hi, I'm Tomas. It's really nice to meet you.
nice to meet you.
We
Tomas.
share a middle name, and we also
Oh.
share that we're from the Bay Area.
Oh, cool.
My question is, a really big thing here at Annenberg, we're not like the most diverse school out here, but when it comes to covering issues of the community, sometimes I feel like I'm pigeonholed into covering the Latino community, the undocumented
Yeah.
community. What do you suggest for students like me who have to want to jump out of that and also do other types of reporting as well?
What a great question. I dealt with that a lot, when I was in newsrooms, because at the time I was open about being gay. And so whenever there was a gay story, they'd go to me and make a little joke that I'm not that gay. I didn't know what that even meant. But it was my own way of kind of going I want a straight person's idea of this. So it's interesting that you're it's this really delicate dance, right? Of course you want to be representative of your community, but knowing that you're not just that thing. And I think that's the kind of awareness that every newsroom should have, right? That we should be allowed to be all kinds of things, that you're not just one thing. So what I've done a lot, is just to make sure that people know that I'm capable of other things, right? So you may talk to me when there's a DACA story breaking, but look, I'm really big into skateboarding, and I just know a lot about skateboards, right? So the only way you can control that is what you produce. So just make sure that what you're producing shows the diversity of how you think about your career. That's really the only thing. And then having people aware that that's an issue.
And also making sure people know what you're interested in. More questions.
It's not working. You want my mic? Wait, let me give you the mic.
Thank you. Hi, I come from Colombia, so it's really nice meeting you. I was wondering if you ever considered approaching this topic from a mental health perspective. I have a friend, coming from Colombia. Well, I came here to study. Basically, I got here, 4 months ago. But my friend, she fell in love with the country. She came on vacation and she decided to stay. And I talked to her 2 days ago, and she was so depressed. She couldn't leave her bed, and she was taking pills. And I was like, I don't think pills is going to solve your problem. And I know you love America. I also know there's a reason why you stayed here. And I don't know if you're coping with this situation of being undocumented in a country you love, knowing that you're basically nobody, right?
So there's a guy named Bob Ross. He's the CEO of the California Endowment. It's like a big foundation here. We did an event, and he read the book. It's a couple of weeks ago now. And he said, Jose, this book is about trauma. And that's actually what the book is about. So it's actually about what you're talking about. I wrote it not realizing I'm a highly functioning depressed person. I didn't really know that about myself. I don't know how I never just, some people use drugs, some people use alcohol. I just use work. If I was juggling 5 things at once, I was fine, right? That wasn't clear to me until I wrote the book. So the book is actually about mental health. I would argue that that is the issue that I would consider it the #1 priority. I probably heard from at least 40 DACA recipients who have decided to leave because they just can't live their lives in 2-year increments, right? Like DACA's for 2 years. And I've been surprised at how many of them just really struggled emotionally with trying to figure out where they fit at this time. So of course I recommended talk to lawyers more than anything. And then after that, therapy, so I've never gotten therapy. The book was therapy. Christina's therapist, sort of. But I'm actually about to see one for the first time next month. I don't know how that's gonna go, but yeah. Please tell her, you got to seek out help. I think it's really important to do that. Yeah. Anyone else? Okay.
Hi. So you're a very skilled storyteller, and you've written
Skilled. All right.
thousands of stories. And I'm curious, what do you believe makes a compelling story? What is the heart of a story to you, and what does it mean to you?
Can I be more specific? Okay, so when I'm writing a book, I had to really think about, because the book is such a long commitment. It's probably the most intimate commitment you have is a book, right? I've done 5 documentaries now, and this was a lot harder. And trying to figure out what experience I'm taking the reader in. So my first big question to myself was, what's the rhythm of this book? How do I want you to feel while you're reading the book? So I answer that question by writing it as if I'm on the run. So the book is written very fast, right? So to me, it's not just the story, but you have to, not all stories are the same. So actually, you all are privileged to be at a time in which a story is gonna tell you, is it really a podcast? Is it really a TV hit? Or is it really a Q&A? Is it really an essay? Is it really reporting? Is it really a profile? So a story has to dictate what it wants to be, right? And you can't just use technology as a way to just attack everything without thinking about how does this story want to be told. For example, I'm talking about the women right now, my example about women who don't report their abuse to police officers. That's a perfect podcast story. Because, they don't want to be named, right? The voices, I can easily see that as a podcast, right? It would be more effective than, say, a news article. And I think that's what's exciting about journalism right now. A story can literally be anything. So please make sure that you're being as cognizant as possible as to how the story wants to tell itself. Yeah. Thanks, Christina.
That actually brings me to a follow-up question. Your Grand Theft Auto piece was probably a text piece, right?
What was that?
It was a text piece, right?
Yeah.
You didn't get to do video of these kids playing video games.
Yeah, it was.
That just shows
words.
how much innovation. I'm sure if the Post did that story today,
I would do that.
It would involve video.
Actually, I was really a troublemaker when I was in the newsroom because I started doing videos 2006 when it was Final Cut Pro version 1. You don't even have you have Premiere now. So, and at the time, the Washington Post was set up where the video production was in a completely different newsrooms in a different state for union reasons. So I'd have to go to Virginia to edit my videos. And my editors would be like, what are you doing videos? You're a writer. So I was always kind of trying to mix mediums. But that was to my advantage. That's how I got into documentary filmmaking, because I had already done short videos. When we were actually in the campaign trail, I started doing those videos, and I didn't really know how to edit, because back then Wi-Fi wasn't that strong, so editing a YouTube video took forever, and then I was late for some of the stuff. So the technology right now to me is so amazing, and it's so quick. But now, that really asks of you to even be more judicious, right? Meaning just because you can doesn't mean you should. So you should ask yourself questions about, okay, how do I really do this story and give it justice?
So more questions? I think there was one in the back.
As a fellow Filipino American, I was just wondering, how do you think your work has influenced the visibility and representation of Filipinos in media?
So I'll repeat the question, which I think was, how has Jose's work influenced the way that Filipinos are looked at here in America and the world?
Last month was Filipino American History Month. One of the primary colors of the Philippines is yellow. That's why the book is yellow.
Is that why your shoes are yellow?
My shoes are yellow. No, just because I know ice. I want to know ice where I am, so I figured why not yellow? Just kidding, Christina, just kidding. I would hope that it has helped improve it, but it's not. I don't think one person can represent one thing, so I'm really big on that. But I'm also big on being unapologetically who you are. And so if people find it good that I talk about being Filipino proudly, that there's Tagalog phrases all around the book. Actually, someone told me that this is probably the most Tagalog ever published in an American book. So I'm proud of that. There's 2 million Filipinos in just the state of California alone. We're the largest Asian group in the state, larger than Chinese, larger than Indians. And yet, for the most part, we're not quote unquote as visible. So this is my way of being visible. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question.
question.
About right here.
Oh, hold on. Wait for the mic. Thanks.
So oh my God, I've never heard my voice. But I know you were talking a little bit about like some advice for undocumented students now, and I was wondering like if you had any advice for undocumented students just in general, whether they're like in the school or in journalism, because I know most of this has been journalism, but just advice that you may have for other students who are also undocumented.
Yeah. The first thing is to make sure you find mentors. I said that's a big one for me. Like, I would not have had a career if I didn't have like layers and layers of mentors. The second thing, because I was just talking to somebody the other day actually, because so many fellowships have citizenship requirements, and so you probably don't recognize, but so many things that you have to apply for have a requirement for citizenship. So a lot of DACA people can't get that. So how do you make sure you don't get really discouraged and depressed if you see that something's not available to you? So I'm really a big proponent in making sure that you're not just looking for the doors that are open, but for the windows that could be open. So whenever you get to the no, you have to find yeses. That's a big one for me, right? Like, you have to find a way to say yes to yourself, even when systems are like, oh, you can't do that, you don't have paperwork, you can't do that because you have this. Like, you have to build a kind of a culture of yes to yourself. That's a big one for me. And I have to tell you though, when I was doing this, that's why now when I talk to a lot of dreamers who don't want to be called dreamers anymore, I don't know why they don't. To young people, to young undocumented people, I ask them to remind themselves that they're so lucky to have each other. You know, like my generation of undocumented people, we didn't have anybody. We couldn't tell anybody. There was no like private Facebook group. I told Christina, I think I was 28 or 29 when I told you. I didn't tell a single friend until 2009, maybe 2010. I just, held all of it in that way. And that was really tough, emotionally. And so at least, even though it may seem tough, at least there's so many more of you and you can find each other. And I think you have to find strength in that. And last thing, the work, right? The work, please make sure that the work is good. Craft is important. Skill is important. It's not enough to want it. You actually have to really work hard at it. And that matters a lot. So, thank you for having
Perfect
me.
note to end on. Thank you, Jose Antonio Vargas.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to all of you. Really appreciate it. This is the book. Make sure to read it.
One last thing. This is like one of the most important people in my life, and I'm just so thrilled that she is here. And so please be always kind to her, okay? That's it.
They are. Thank you.